and you are set to go, ma'am.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for coming to this talk on the last day of this awesome conference. Just a quick introduction to myself. So I am a master's student here at UNL. And before that, I'm actually from Toledo, Ohio. So I did my undergraduate at the University of Toledo. Then I actually worked for a couple years for the city park system. And then I also worked for a couple years out in Nevada doing vegetation surveys on Burns lands. And then I decided to come back and get a master's degree. And so I ended up here in Lincoln. And I think it was a great decision because I got to have this really cool project about the American burying beetle. And so I will just jump right in. And so I'm talking about screening land cover types on a shifting landscape that supports the endangered, asterisk, American burying beetle, Nicrophorus americanus. So just a quick overview. I'm going to give you some background on the American burying beetle, talk briefly about my study area, and just kind of tell you what the importance of this work is and what my research objectives were. Then we'll get into the methods, results, and then the conclusion. So the American burying beetle, it's actually the largest native carrion beetle for North America. It is originally it ranged across the entire eastern half of the United States, but they found that around in the 1980s they were noticing that it had declined and was not being found in very many areas at all, which led to it being listed as federally endangered in 1989. And it was listed as such until just this year in 2020. It was downgraded to threatened on the Federal Register. It is still endangered in the state of Nebraska, but federally it's only threatened currently. And you can see the map here shows its current distribution. So we have like this pretty strong population up in the Sandhills area, and then this population here in the Les Canyons, which is actually my study area. Then this very strong population down in eastern Oklahoma, kind of bleeding into some of the surrounding states. And then the only other naturally occurring population is this one actually here in Block Island, which is an island off the coast of Rhode Island. And then they have a few other populations that are introduced. So there's an introduced population on Nantucket Island in the Atlantic. Then there's an introduced population in Ohio here, and an introduced or experimental is what they call it, population in Missouri. And so it's still endangered here in Nebraska, and this is our study area. Briefly, the life cycle, which makes this such a cool beetle, is that it's a carrion beetle, and as such, it actually requires vertebrate carrion throughout its life cycle. So it's actually kind of a scavenger and decomposer in the ecosystem that helps cycle nutrients through the system. And what the adults do is they actually find a good piece of carrion, and they will, claim it. And it's usually a pair of a male-female pair so that they can breed on it. And what they do is they'll prepare it to be buried underground. So they remove all the fur or feathers. They kind of roll it into this ball, cover it with this secretion that actually preserves it, and then they bury it underground. And it's pretty cool. They have this brood chamber underground. They lay their eggs in the soil, and they actually the parents will stick around and help care for their young. Protect their larvae and help feed them. Once the larvae go into the soil to pupate, the adults will leave, and then usually by end of July or early August, all of the young have pupated and emerged from the soil as the new generation of adults. And usually by now, all of the old adults have died off, and so the only remaining ones are actually probably in the soil now hibernating for the winter, and then they will emerge next spring. So in our study area of the Les Canyons, we've been trapping, Game and Parks has been trapping, since actually before 2007, but the permanent trap locations were established in 2007. And these are all of those locations. There's 28 trap locations. And the way we sample is with this large pitfall trap that's like kind of like a 5-gallon bucket that we bury into the soil. And as you can see, we throw some bait in there, which is actually usually an aged laboratory rat. And so it's been aged in the sun for a few days to get really nice and stinky so that we can draw in all of those carrion beetles. And there's a couple different ways to secure it. We have a lid on there to protect it from the sun and the rain, and so that they can't fly away. And then you can stake it down. You can have a wire mesh if there's a lot of scavenger activity like coyotes and stuff. We usually have the traps out there for about 5 consecutive days, and we check that every day in the morning. And we remove all of the beetles. We catch a lot of other carrion beetles that are not the endangered or threatened ones, but we tag the American bearing beetle and then release them. And so actually this is what it would kind of look like. The image on the right here, these are all actually non-ABB carrion beetles. And so we would see what species there are and kind of estimate how many there are. So that's kind of what it looks like inside of a trap before we've really started digging in. And then here on the right is just 2 ABB that have been tagged, and they're ready to be released back into the wild. So our study area is the Lost Canyons, and it's this area that's got this steep eroded like hills, and the soil is like this wind deposited loess, which is kind of like a silty loam, and since it's such a light soil, it is very easily eroded. You can kind of see in this image what some of that erosion might look like here and there. Since it's so steep, it's mostly used as grazing, and it supports a mixed grass prairie. The more level areas, they can do a little bit of agriculture on there. In addition to the ABB, there are other rare species like the burrowing owl and the loggerhead shrike, and it is actually a BUL, so it's a biologically unique landscape here in Nebraska. Unfortunately, it's kind of undergoing this regime shift from grassland to woodland because of the eastern red cedar that's kind of invading. And to combat that regime shift, a lot of landowners have been using prescribed fire. And as you can see in this picture, these are actually, this is after a burn has happened. And these are all the skeletons of the red cedars that are still standing. All right, so kind of like why this is important. Well, firstly, we're monitoring the sensitive and rare species. So that's always cool, and it's always nice to understand what's going on with those types of species. And the beetle, it's of interest to many landowners. I mean, partially because they have to manage for it since it's, was endangered and now threatened. And also, I mean, a lot of people, it's just a cool bug that they're happy that they have this cool insect on their land. And since this region is undergoing those threats from the woody encroachment, we figured that our results can help inform the restoration activities that are happening in the Lost Canyons. And so to that end, our objectives were firstly to model the annual predicted ABB abundance. Second, determine the relationship between ABB presence and land cover types. Third, find the spatial scales that best predict ABB presence for each land cover type. And four, determine the relationship between ABB presence and certain selected weather variables. All right, so our methods, I'll go through quick because there's a lot more results that I want to dig into. So where we're pulling our data is like actually several data sets. Firstly, we have our ABB surveys from 2007 to 2019 that I kind of talked about, how we got that data. Then we have this land cover data that's pulled also actually, so Tori had mentioned that RAP, the Rangeland Analysis Platform, that's where we're getting this stuff as well. So we have all these cover types that we have data for the same years that the surveys were done. And we also have that at 6 different spatial scales that are ranging from a very local fine scale of 0.8 hectares, which is about 2 acres, ranging all the way up to this really large window size of, it's over 1,700 hectares, which is about 4,300 acres. So that way we kind of get a range of what the land cover is doing at different window sizes. So we look really close and then look kind of more broadly. And then our third data set are these weather variables that we kind of wanted to help when we were modeling, kind of describe what our why we're getting the data that we are. I'll explain that more in a second, but those variables were average wind speed, the fog, which is a presence absence, minimum temperature, and precipitation. Our analysis was actually this. We first used a Bayesian end mixture model to estimate the relative abundance of the ABB. And in that model, we put in the 7 land cover types as our linear fixed effects predictors. And then the 4 weather variables, those were our detection probability predictors. So they help inform why we are not detecting ABBs at these traps. Then we found what the best scales, so of those 6 spatial scales ranging fine to very broad, we determined what the best scale for each land cover type was using this BLISS method, which that stands for Bayesian Latent Indicator Scale Selection, which is a method that was outlined by Stuber et al. This method, what it does, it kind of selects the best performing scale for each variable after trying out every possible combination. And it also estimates the effects of these variables on ABB. So like, are these variables helping or harming, or like how are they affecting the ABB? All right, so we'll go right into the results. There's a lot to cover. So first, kind of what we did was we sort of took all of our data and kind of just threw it on the canvas, if you will, to see what stuck. And so what we're looking at here with this map is, well, first, all of these purple circles, those are all of our trap locations, so all 28. And the size of those circles indicates the mean abundance across all sampling years. So the larger the circle, the greater the mean abundance is for ABB at that trap. And then these green polygons here, those are all of the burn units that have been going on in the Les Canyons. That is actually incomplete. If you had seen the map that Tori had shown of the Les Canyons, she had additional burns. So there is actually several burns up in this region here that I think one of them is also a wildfire that wasn't mapped. The blue to red gradient here is the covariance of trees and grasses. And so really what you need to know is, like, the more red it is, the more trees there are in that area. So when we mapped this, what we saw was that, well, the greatest mean abundance of our traps seems to be here in this kind of like closer to the core of burn units. And then we definitely noticed that there's a lower abundance of ABB near the periphery of the Les Canyons. So like here in the south and the southwest and the western portions. That's where there's a lot more cropland, and in addition, there's a lot lower abundance up here in the northern portion, and that's where those trees are. So like kind of going into our analysis, we're expecting like, okay, well, it seems like the ABB maybe don't like cropland so much, and maybe not so much juniper woodland. So then we did this generalized additive model, and this is a prediction plot, and it's using that Bayesian approach. It's showing the estimated yearly abundance of ABB, and this is across the entire Les Canyons. So all of the traps kind of lumped together, all 28 traps. And so this has kind of been indicating to us that there's a moderate increase in ABB abundance over time, which is definitely good news for folks in the canyons who are managing for the beetle. Next, we wanted to determine the spatial scales that were important to the beetle. So remember, there's those 6 spatial scales that range down from about 2 acres to up to over around 4,300 acres. And that BLISS approach, if you recall, it's selecting the best performing spatial scale after evaluating all of our possible combinations. And so this is kind of what we got from that. So I'll kind of take you through this. So the larger the bar, that means the best scale is indicative of that. And our scales are here on the bottom axis. And so as you can see, we have, for bare ground, it's kind of one of those larger scales, a broader scale across the landscape. Cropland was a bit split, but mostly was the best performing was a smaller, finer local scale. Litter was kind of an intermediate scale, kind of in the middle, not really fine and not very broad. Management was also a very fine local scale that was the best performing. Perennial forbs and grasses was also had a bit of a spread, but that was also the best performing was an intermediate spatial scale. The spatial covariance of grass to woodies, that was also a fine local scale. And then lastly, the tree cover, the best performing scale for that was the largest scale, which is broadest across the landscape. And so I kind of just put that here into this table so that we'll come back to this later, but just kind of putting the best scale for each cover type and if it's local or broad or sort of in the middle. Next, we kind of wanted to determine for each cover type how it's affecting the ABB abundance. And so this is showing whether or not there's kind of like a positive or negative relationship between each cover type at that scale and the ABB. So here you can see like bare ground and crop, the first two, both of them have this, actually it's a negative impact on the ABB. So like we had expected for cropland, it's a negative impact on the ABB and the bare ground as well. Litter is actually a positive impact management. So the prescribed fire is actually indeterminate. It could be weakly positive or negative. Our model was indeterminate on that. Perennial forbs and grasses had the strongest positive impact on the American burying beetle. Spatial covariance of grass and woodies was also indeterminate. It looks like it could be weakly negative, but it's within that. These bars are the 95% and then 99% error bars, and so it could be weakly positive. And tree cover was weakly positive as well. And so this is that table again, and I just added in what that relationship was, whether it was positive or negative. And so here we can see bare ground and crop were negative, litter and perennial forbs, grasses, and trees were positive.
3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Lastly, there's these, the environmental predictors. I'll just go really quick, but we saw that average wind speed was mostly negative, but could be weakly positive. Fog was positive. Minimum temperature was definitely clearly positive, which makes sense because on cold nights, we don't usually catch a lot of beetles in the morning. So the warmer the overnight low temperature, if that makes sense, the better. And then precipitation was also weakly positive. And then I added in this a little extra bit. I'll go really quick since I'm getting short on time, but this was just an additional, this is not in regards with the beetle trapping. This was part of a different part of my thesis. And so this is some vegetation monitoring that I did. So we had 13 plots, or 13 paired plots, so a total of 26. One was an unburned juniper woodland, the other's a burned juniper woodland, and so that means it's actually stand collapsed. So that's when you have all those skeletons standing there. And what we did was we measured the percent basal cover of all herbaceous species in these areas. And basically we saw that the average basal cover of herbaceous species is higher in collapsed juniper stands than in the unburned stands. So basically what we're saying is unburned juniper woodland has very, very low plant cover for herbaceous species, whereas the burned juniper has a much higher overall, higher percent cover. All right, then I'll just jump into my conclusions really quick. I have a minute or two, it looks like. So kind of the takeaway things I'd like y'all to remember would be, well, we saw that the ABB, they relate to their habitat at these different spatial scales. So crop, fire management, and the covariance was those fine local scales. Litter and perennial forbs grasses they were most impactful at intermediate scales. And then bare ground and tree cover, those had the greatest impact at these broad scales across the landscape. The second thing is that perennial forbs and grasses and litter, they both have a strong positive impact on the ABB as opposed to bare ground and crop cover have a strong negative impact on the ABB. Then broader implications. So prescribed fire, it really does have this complicated relationship with the ABB. So the direct impact that we saw in our model, it was inconclusive. It could really be weakly positive or negative. There is the immediate effect of prescribed fire in that it creates bare ground, and if you recall, bare ground is negative for the ABB. But there's this indirect impact in that prescribed fire is increasing forbs and grasses across the landscape. And so our takeaway is that it's really, prescribed fire is a net positive for the beetle. It's also important to remember that spatial scales matter. Even small changes on the landscape can ripple outward and collectively have large impacts, and that the lessons learned here can inform prescribed fire efforts in other places that have to manage for the ABB, like the Sandhills or Oklahoma. And then just a real quick sort of, since it's a 10-year legacy conference, right? It's sort of 10 years. So if the current trends continue, well, firstly, we'll have like double the surveying data that we have now for the ABB, since we've been those permanent traps since 2007. So we'll have 10 extra years of data, which is just a gold mine for scientists, right? Next would be if the ABB population trend keeps going upwards, we might even double our population. That would be really cool. And then if our current trends continue, we're going to have even more grassland restored, which is also really cool. Or maybe there's the alternate future that's a little bit less cool. Like, well, we also know that, they just got downgraded to threatened. So is that going to mean there's less funding available for management for the ABB? And is there going to be less interest, for the ABB among landowners and other stakeholders? So that's just, I guess, food for thought. Let's hope for the better future, the bright future. But with that, I'd like to thank Game and Parks for their awesome data, TJ Walker and Andy Moore and Adam Kester, who have been like the core for beetle trapping. And then the Twiddle Lab, especially Caleb Roberts, who helped with all these awesome analyses, Dan Uden, who helped with a lot of the getting the data all ready to go, and of course Dirac. And yeah, I guess I can take questions if we have a little time. Thank you.